The city did not fall in a day. Most people imagine ancient warfare as something cinematic: charging soldiers, clashing swords, dramatic last stands. But the most devastating military tool of the ancient world was not the sword. It was patience. It was the siege. And in the world where Jesus walked, preached, and was crucified, the memory of sieges was not history. It was living wound. To understand what a siege meant in first-century Judea, you need to stop thinking about battles and start thinking about bread, about water, about the slow arithmetic of survival. What did it actually feel like to be inside a walled city when the enemy closed the roads? What happened to families, to children, to the elderly, to the sick, when the grain stores began to thin? And why did Jesus, standing before the walls of Jerusalem with his disciples, weep? Not because of an abstract prophecy, but because he could see, with devastating clarity, exactly what was coming. Stay until the end, because understanding this changes how we read the Gospels and how we understand the world that formed them. In the first century, cities in Roman-controlled Judea were not sprawling metropolises. Most were dense, layered, and enclosed, built vertically out of necessity, pressed together behind stone walls that had been repaired, reinforced, and fought over for generations. Jerusalem itself sat on hills, its streets narrow and uneven, its neighborhoods stacked like terraces cut into the rock. The smell of the lower city was constant: animals, cooking fires, tanning leather, human waste channeled through open gutters that ran along the walls of houses. A typical home in the lower quarters was small, 1 or 2 rooms built from rough limestone blocks, with a flat rooftop used for sleeping in summer, drying figs, and storing tools. The ground floor often housed a donkey or goat at night, both for the animal's protection and for the warmth that radiated into the sleeping space above. Fuel was scarce. Every piece of dried dung, every bundle of dry straw, had value. Water was the central anxiety of daily life. Jerusalem had no river. It depended on cisterns, deep stone reservoirs carved beneath houses and courtyards, filled during the rainy season and rationed through the dry months. Families knew exactly how much water they had. They counted it the way a merchant counts coins. A broken cistern seal, a crack in the plaster lining, a dry winter, any of these could shift a household from security to desperation within weeks. Food moved through the city on foot, carried in ceramic jars, woven baskets, and cloth sacks. Grain was stored in sealed clay vessels, buried sometimes beneath the floor to protect it from moisture and rats. Olive oil was currency as much as it was food, pressed in stone mills that every village maintained, traded across regions, stored in amphorae that were themselves expensive to produce. Nothing was wasted. The dregs of oil were used for lamps. The lamps burned through the night because darkness in a first-century city was not romantic. It was dangerous. This was the world enclosed inside the walls. Dense, resourceful, fragile. And when a Roman army arrived and began to build its circumvallation wall, the encircling barrier that sealed every gate, every road, every escape route, that fragile, carefully balanced world began, slowly and then catastrophically, to collapse. The Romans did not invent the siege, but they perfected it. By the time of Jesus, Roman military engineering had developed the siege into something close to a science: methodical, patient, and merciless. When a Roman general decided to take a fortified city, he did not gamble on a frontal assault if he could avoid it. He built, he dug, he waited, and he understood something that the defenders inside the walls understood too. With growing dread, time was always on the side of the army that ate well. The first thing a Roman force did upon surrounding a city was construct a siege wall, a circumvallation. This was not a metaphor. It was a physical barrier, sometimes kilometers long, built from earth, timber, and stone, studded with towers and patrolled day and night. Its purpose was absolute. Nothing in, nothing out. No food. No water.
No messengers. No escape.
Josephus, the Jewish historian who witnessed the Roman siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD, just 4 decades after the crucifixion, describes this wall being built around the entire city in a matter of days. Thousands of laborious, continuous shifts. The sound of axes, hammers, and grinding stone audible from inside the city walls, growing closer, more deliberate, more final. Inside the city, the psychology of that sound cannot be overstated. Imagine waking before dawn in a house in the lower city of Jerusalem. The usual sounds are gone. No merchants calling from the market, no caravans passing through the gates, no pilgrims arriving from the roads of Galilee. Instead, there is a low, persistent hammering from beyond the walls. It does not stop. It is there when you sleep, when you pray, when you nurse your child. It is the sound of your world being sealed shut. The first weeks of a siege were marked not by violence but by adjustment. Families rationed. Neighbors who had always been friendly began to guard their grain stores more carefully. The price of bread inside a besieged city could rise within weeks to levels that made it inaccessible to the poor. Josephus records specific prices during the Jerusalem siege, figures so extreme that they read less like economics and more like a slow death sentence for anyone without substantial reserves. This is where the social fractures of the ancient world became lethal. In normal times, the gap between a prosperous merchant family and a day laborious household was significant but survivable. The laborer worked, earned, bought food at the market. The system, imperfect and often brutal, still functioned. But under siege conditions, that gap became an abyss. The wealthy family with sealed grain stores, a deep cistern, and dried provisions could endure for months. The laborious family, with perhaps 3 or 4 days of food in the house on any given morning, faced catastrophe within the first weeks. Jesus knew this world. He had walked through towns where widows scraped for 2 small coins. He had watched fishermen calculate the worth of a catch against the cost of nets, taxes, and salt. He had seen the granaries of the wealthy and the empty hands of the poor. When he told stories about tenants and landowners, about servants and debts, about the man who built bigger barns while others went hungry, he was not constructing abstract moral lessons. He was describing a social architecture that, under the pressure of siege, would reveal its cruelest fault lines. Water ran out before the grain did. This is one of the details that history books tend to skip, but it is the detail that explains everything about how sieges destroyed cities from the inside. A human being can survive weeks without adequate food. Weakened, yes. Desperate, yes, but alive. Without water, survival is measured in days. And in a city like Jerusalem, where every drop depended on cisterns filled months earlier by winter rains, the mathematics of thirst became the siege commander's most reliable weapon. The cisterns beneath Jerusalem's houses and public buildings were remarkable feats of engineering, plastered, sealed, and carved deep into the bedrock beneath the city. A well-maintained household cistern could hold enough water to sustain a family through the dry summer months. But they were designed for normal consumption, normal population. A city swollen with refugees, pilgrims trapped by the timing of a festival, soldiers, and frightened families crowding in from surrounding villages. That same cistern emptied in days instead of months. And the poor had no cisterns of their own. Water in the ancient city moved through a hierarchy as rigid as any social structure. The temple complex had its own massive underground reservoirs, fed by aqueducts. Wealthy households had private cisterns. Everyone else depended on public pools, shared wells, and the generosity, or commerce, of those who had access. In normal times, this was an inconvenience and an indignity. Under siege, it became a sentence. This is the world in which Jesus spoke about living water. When he sat beside the well at Sychar and spoke to a Samaritan woman about water that would mean she would never thirst again, he was not reaching for a poetic metaphor disconnected from daily experience. He was speaking to a woman who walked to that well every day, in heat, carrying heavy stone or clay vessels, navigating the social weight of being who she was in a society that had measured and judged her. Water was not a symbol to her. It was the organizing fact of her day. And Jesus met her precisely there, at the place where her physical need and her social vulnerability intersected. That is the texture of his ministry, consistently, almost stubbornly grounded in the material conditions of real life. But return to the siege, because the siege is where that material world reaches its breaking point. As weeks passed inside a besieged city, the social order that normally kept violence contained began to dissolve. Josephus describes factions within Jerusalem during the Roman siege turning on each other, armed groups seizing grain stores, executing those suspected of hoarding, burning food supplies in acts of factional rage that accelerated the very starvation they claimed to be fighting against. The enemy outside the walls was patient and well-fed. The city inside was consuming itself. Families made unthinkable decisions. Parents hid food from children to preserve strength for one more day. Neighbors who had shared meals for decades became strangers, then threats. The shame of begging, profound in a culture structured around honor and family provision, dissolved into something rawer and more desperate. People ate leather. They ate the skins of animals. Josephus, writing as a witness, records details so extreme that later readers assumed he was exaggerating. Archaeological evidence from siege contexts across the ancient Near East confirms that he was not. The Romans, camped outside in organized formations, with supply lines stretching back through the empire, simply waited. Jesus wept over Jerusalem. The Gospel of Luke records the moment with unusual precision. He was descending the Mount of Olives, approaching the city, and when it came into view, the walls, the temple gleaming white and gold in the sun, the dense neighborhood packed with life, he stopped. And he wept. Not quietly. The Greek word Luke uses suggests something more like sobbing. A grief that rose from somewhere deep and would not be contained. And then he spoke. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and the children within your walls. He was describing a siege. Technically, precisely, and with the vocabulary of someone who understood exactly what that meant, not as prophecy delivered from a safe distance, but as a man who knew what happened to cities when the walls closed and the water ran low and the grain ran out. He had grown up in a region where the memory of sieges was embedded in stone and story. He had walked past ruins. He had heard elders speak of what the armies of history had done to cities that resisted. His weeping was not theatrical. It was the grief of someone who could see the future with terrible clarity and knew that the people he loved could not. 4 decades later, in 70 AD, everything he described happened. The Roman general Titus surrounded Jerusalem with exactly the kind of circumvallation wall the ancient sources describe, a siege barrier that sealed the city completely during the festival of Passover, trapping hundreds of thousands of pilgrims inside alongside the permanent population. What followed over the next several months became one of the most documented catastrophes of the ancient world. The city that had stood for centuries, the city that housed the temple, the city that was the center of Jewish worship and identity, was systematically starved, breached, and destroyed. The temple burned. The walls were pulled down. The population that survived was enslaved or scattered. Understanding this does not make the Gospel of Luke darker. It makes it more human. Because what the historical context of sieges reveals is not a distant, dramatic spectacle. It reveals the specific weight of what Jesus carried as he walked toward Jerusalem. He was not walking toward an abstract theological confrontation. He was walking into a city he loved, knowing what cities looked like when armies encircled them, knowing the particular suffering that waited for the children he saw playing in the streets, the women drawing water from the public pools, the merchants arranging their goods in the shadow of the temple walls. His teachings about forgiveness, about enemies, about the kingdom that operates by a different logic than power and domination, they did not emerge from comfortable reflection. They emerged from a world where the alternative to that kingdom was precisely what sieges produced: hunger weaponized against the innocent, social bonds dissolved by desperation, the slow arithmetic of survival that always crushed the poor first and hardest. The faith that grew from his life was not born in abstraction. It was born in the dust and heat of a world where water mattered, where grain mattered, where the walls of a city were the difference between life and death, and where a man stood on a hillside, looked at a city he loved, and allowed himself to feel the full weight of what was coming. That is the Jesus history gives us. Not a figure floating above the ancient world. A man standing inside it, weeping,